Hey guys! Tonight we are delving into the shadowy, twisting corridors of Greek mythology, not to face a monster directly, but to explore the mind of the brilliant, tormented genius who was tasked with creating its inescapable prison. We're talking about Daedalus, the master craftsman, the legendary inventor, and his most infamous commission engineering the Labyrinth for King Minos of Crete, a bewildering maze designed to house the fearsome Minotaur. Imagine yourself in ancient Crete, the warm Mediterranean air, thick with the scent of thyme and the sea, but also with whispers of royal secrets and divine curses. You see Daedalus, his brow furrowed not with the joy of creation, but with the heavy burden of a morally complex, terrifyingly difficult engineering challenge. This isn't just about building a clever maze. It's about containing a tragedy, a royal shame, a creature that is both innocent and monstrous. And honestly, if you were suddenly handed the blueprints for a structure designed to imprison a half-man, half-bull with a taste for human flesh, and told, make sure it's escape-proof, or else, you probably wouldn't survive the sheer stress of the quarterly progress reviews with King Minos, let alone the ethical nightmares. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, maybe drop a comment to let us know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always wonderful to feel our global community of history and myth lovers drawing near. Now, dim the lights maybe, turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself on the vibrant, sun-drenched island of Crete during its legendary Minoan Golden Age, or perhaps slightly after. As myths often compress and entangle timelines, the air is alive with the sounds of a bustling port, the distant cry of gulls and the murmur of an ancient, sophisticated civilization. But beneath the surface of this thriving island kingdom ruled by the powerful and often imperious King Minos lies a dark secret, a royal shame that needs to be contained. And the man tasked with this monumental feat of engineering and secrecy is Daedalus, an Athenian by birth, an inventor and craftsman of unparalleled skill, whose genius is both his greatest gift and, as we shall see, a source of profound personal torment. Daedalus is a name that echoes through Greek mythology, synonymous with ingenuity, artistry, and a certain tragic brilliance. He is credited with inventing all manner of wondrous things, lifelike moving statues, intricate tools, perhaps even the very concept of sails for ships. His skill was said to rival that of the gods themselves, a dangerous comparison in a world where divine jealousy was a common occupational hazard for overly talented mortals. But here in Crete, under the patronage, or perhaps the gilded imprisonment of King Minos, Daedalus is about to face his most challenging and morally ambiguous commission yet. He is not being asked to create a thing of beauty or utility for the betterment of mankind. He is being asked to design and build a prison, a structure of such bewildering complexity that it can hold a creature of nightmare, a being that embodies a divine curse and a royal family's deepest, darkest secret, the Minotaur. This isn't a simple dungeon with bars and locks. This needs to be something more, something that confuses the mind as much as it confines the body, a place where hope of escape withers and dies in an endless succession of identical twisting passages. This is the Labyrinth. And as you watch Daedalus receive this royal command, you can almost feel the weight settling upon his shoulders, the weight of his own genius being turned to a dark purpose, the weight of complicity in concealing a monstrous truth, and the dawning perhaps of his own personal dilemma. The story of Daedalus and the Labyrinth is more than just a tale of clever engineering. It's a story about the responsibility of the creator, the nature of imprisonment, both physical and psychological, and the often unforeseen consequences of our greatest achievements. It explores the fine line between innovation and hubris, between serving a powerful patron and serving one's own conscience. Mainstream historical fact often gets tangled with myth here, as Daedalus is a legendary figure, but the archaeological remains of the sprawling palace complex at Knossos in Crete, with its intricate layout, have often been speculatively linked to the Labyrinth legend, providing a tantalizing, if not definitive, physical backdrop to the myth. Historians still argue whether the myth of the Labyrinth and the Minotaur was a purely symbolic Greek invention to explain or denigrate the earlier powerful Minoan civilization, or if it contains echoes of actual Minoan religious practices, perhaps involving bull-leaping rituals, sacred caves, or complex palatial architecture that seemed maze-like to outsiders. Whatever its deepest origins for Daedalus within the narrative, the task is terrifyingly real. He must use all his skill, all his ingenuity to create a structure that will not only contain a monster, but will also stand as a monument to a terrible secret. And as he begins to ponder the spirals, the dead ends, the false turns, you can sense the dilemma taking root in his heart. He is the master builder, about to construct his most infamous and perhaps most regretted masterpiece. You're now standing beside Daedalus in Crete, the warm Mediterranean breeze doing little to cool the unease settling upon him as he contemplates King Minos' monstrous commission. To fully understand the genius and perhaps the tragedy of this man, and why he of all people was chosen for such a task, we need to rewind a little to journey back to his origins in the bustling, intellectually vibrant city of Athens. For Daedalus was not always an artisan in the service of a Cretan king. He was once the most celebrated craftsman in his native city, a figure whose skill was said to be divinely inspired, yet whose pride and jealousy would ultimately lead to his downfall and exile. Imagine the young Daedalus in his Athenian workshop. The air is filled with the scent of cedar wood, bronze, and perhaps the faint, sharp tang of some new invention taking shape. He is a whirlwind of creative energy, his hands capable of fashioning wonders that astound his contemporaries. He is credited with inventing or perfecting numerous tools essential for carpentry and sculpture: the axe, the plumb line, the awl, the level, even glue. He sculpted statues so lifelike it was said they could see and move their eyes open, their limbs seemingly ready to step down from their pedestals. This is a mainstream historical fact. Daedalus is a prominent figure in Greek mythology, celebrated as a supremely skilled artisan, inventor, and architect, traditionally believed to be of Athenian origin, and credited with numerous innovations in sculpture and mechanics, making statues appear animated. His name itself became synonymous with cunning craftsmanship. He was a descendant, some said, of Hephaestus, the smith god of invention, or perhaps of the royal house of Athens itself. Whatever his lineage, his talent was undeniable. He was the shining star of Athenian artistry, the one everyone looked to for innovation and beauty. But genius, as we know, can often walk hand in hand with a certain sensitivity about one's own preeminence. And Daedalus, for all his skill, possessed a fierce pride and a growing jealousy, particularly towards anyone who might threaten his position as Athens' foremost inventor. This brings us to the tragic figure of Perdix, or Talos as he is sometimes called, Daedalus' own nephew, his sister's son, whom he had taken on as an apprentice. Young Perdix was a prodigy, a budding genius whose inventive mind quickly began to rival and perhaps even surpass that of his master. The stories tell of Perdix observing the backbone of a fish, or the jawbone of a serpent, and from this inventing the saw, a tool of revolutionary importance. Another tale credits him with inventing the potter's wheel, or the compass for drawing circles. Daedalus, watching his young apprentice's star rise so rapidly, felt not pride, but a growing gnawing envy. He saw his own fame being eclipsed, his own singular status as Athens' greatest craftsman, threatened by this brilliant upstart, his own kin. The culmination of this jealousy is a dark and pivotal moment in Daedalus' story. According to most accounts, overwhelmed by envy and fear of being surpassed, Daedalus lured young Perdix to the top of the Acropolis, the sacred citadel of Athens, and then in a fit of jealous rage pushed him off. It was a shocking act, a betrayal of trust, of family, and of the sacred bond between master and apprentice. But the gods, it seems, were watching. As Perdix fell, the goddess Athena, patron of Athens and of craftsmen, took pity on him and transformed him into a partridge Perdix in Greek, the bird that still bears his name and is said to always fly low to the ground, forever mindful of its terrifying fall. It's a rather charming, if melancholy, quirky tidbit that the partridge in Greek folklore became a symbol of ingenuity, but also of a life cut short, or a talent not fully realized on a human plane, forever skittering close to the earth rather than soaring. Perhaps Daedalus in later years would hear the call of a partridge and feel a fresh pang of his ancient guilt. This act of murder, or attempted murder, did not go unnoticed by the Athenians. Daedalus was brought before the Areopagus, the ancient and venerable Athenian court, and was tried for his crime. He was found guilty and condemned, forced to flee his beloved Athens in exile. his reputation as a brilliant artisan now forever tainted by this dark deed. Historians still argue whether the story of Perdiccas' murder was a later addition to Daedalus' myth designed to explain his presence in Crete and to add a layer of tragic flaw to his genius, or if it reflects some deeper, perhaps even ritualistic conflict within ancient Athenian artisan guilds. Regardless of its historical or symbolic underpinnings for the narrative of Daedalus, this act of jealous violence is the catalyst that sets him on the path to Crete and ultimately to his infamous Labyrinth. So you see Daedalus arriving on the shores of Crete, not as a celebrated hero, but as a fugitive, a man running from his past, his immense talents now for hire to King Minos. He is welcomed, his skills recognized and valued by the Cretan king, who was always keen to adorn his court with the best artists and craftsmen. For a time, Daedalus thrives in Crete, creating wonders for Minos, perhaps the famous dancing floor for Ariadne or intricate automata. He even finds love marrying a Cretan woman named Naukriti and fathers a son, the ill-fated Icarus, whose story we all know is tragically intertwined with his father's. But the shadow of his past, and the inherent complexities of serving a powerful, often ruthless king, would soon lead him to a new and far more profound moral and creative challenge. The exiled artisan of Athens was about to become the reluctant architect of a monstrous prison. You've now witnessed the tragic turn of events that led Daedalus, Athens' once celebrated artisan, to become an exile, his genius forever shadowed by the death of his nephew Perdiccas. He flees his homeland seeking refuge and perhaps a fresh start, and his journey takes him across the Aegean Sea to the powerful island kingdom of Crete, ruled by the legendary King Minos. Here in the opulent and sophisticated court at Knossos, Daedalus finds a new patron, a new stage for his incredible talents. But this gilded cage, as it would eventually become, held its own secrets, its own divine curses, and would soon present Daedalus with the most daunting and morally complex task of his life. Imagine yourself arriving with Daedalus at Knossos, the magnificent palace complex that was the heart of Minoan civilization. This wasn't a rustic hill fort. Knossos, as revealed by archaeology, was a sprawling, multi-storied labyrinthine structure in its own right, with brightly colored frescoes depicting scenes of bull-leaping, graceful dolphins and enigmatic priestesses. There were sophisticated plumbing systems, grand courtyards, intricate storerooms, and throne rooms adorned with striking art. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Palace of Knossos in Crete, the center of the Minoan civilization, flourishing c. 2700. 1450 BCE was a vast and complex architectural marvel featuring advanced engineering, extensive storage facilities, pathoi jars, light wells, and vibrant frescoes, its intricate layout possibly contributing to the later Greek myths of the Labyrinth. For Daedalus, an architect and inventor, it must have been a stimulating, if perhaps slightly overwhelming environment. King Minos himself was a figure of immense power and authority, said to be a son of Zeus and Europa. He ruled over a thalassocracy, a maritime empire that controlled the Aegean trade routes. He was known for his wisdom. He was one of the 3 judges of the dead in the underworld, according to some traditions, but also for his pride, his ambition, and at times his ruthlessness. His court would have been a place of intrigue, diplomacy, and displays of wealth and power. Artists, craftsmen, poets, and emissaries from distant lands would have thronged to Knossos seeking favor or offering tribute. It was into this sophisticated yet potentially perilous environment that Daedalus brought his unparalleled skills. Minos, recognizing Daedalus's genius, welcomed him warmly. The king was a great patron of the arts and sciences, and he saw in Daedalus an artisan capable of creating wonders that would further enhance the glory of his kingdom. For a time, Daedalus flourished. He designed and built marvelous things for the royal family, intricate toys for the royal children, perhaps elegant jewelry for Queen Pasiphae, or even, as some myths suggest, the famous dancing floor choros for Princess Ariadne, a place where intricate ritual dances could be performed. He was the chief engineer, the royal inventor, the go-to man for any project requiring supreme skill and ingenuity. He probably had a nice office, a decent expense account mostly in olive oil and fine wine, one imagines, and was for a while quite content. Or as content as an exiled genius with a dark secret in his past could be. But the Cretan royal family had its own dark secrets, its own entanglements with the gods, which were far more dangerous than any Athenian court politics. Queen Pasiphae, Minos' wife, was a daughter of Helios, the sun god, a woman of divine heritage and strong passions. And it is her story, her tragic and rather bizarre transgression, that will ultimately lead to Daedalus' greatest and most terrible creation. The gilded cage of Knossos, for all its beauty and sophistication, was also a place where divine wrath could strike with devastating consequences. There's a quirky and rather telling tidbit about King Minos' own reputation in Greek myth. While sometimes portrayed as a wise lawgiver, he is also often depicted as proud, autocratic, and even cruel, particularly in the Athenian myths that cast him as the one who demanded the tribute of young Athenians to be fed to the Minotaur. This duality reflects the complex relationship between mainland Greece and the earlier powerful Minoan civilization. A mixture of awe, resentment, and perhaps a desire to reinterpret Minoan culture through a Greek lens, often casting Minoan power in a more sinister light. Daedalus, an Athenian in the court of this powerful Cretan king, would have been navigating very tricky political and cultural waters. He wasn't just an employee, he was a valuable asset and potentially a pawn in larger games. Historians still argue about the precise historical reality behind the figure of King Minos and the extent of Minoan power. Was Minos a specific king's name or a dynastic title like Pharaoh? How much of the later Greek mythology about Crete reflects actual Minoan history and how much is later Greek invention or reinterpretation? The palace at Knossos certainly speaks of a highly organized, wealthy, and artistically advanced society, but the true nature of its rulers and their relationship with mainland Greece remains shrouded in the mists of the Bronze Age, a fascinating puzzle for archaeologists and historians to piece together. For Daedalus, however, the immediate reality was the patronage of this powerful king in this magnificent labyrinthine palace. He was for now safe from his Athenian past, his talents recognized, his creativity given free rein, or so it seemed. But the very splendor of Knossos, the very power of Minos, was built upon a delicate balance with the gods, a balance that was about to be catastrophically upset, leading to a monstrous birth, and a royal command that would forever bind Daedalus' name to one of the most terrifying and ingenious structures in all of mythology. The comfortable cage was about to become a workshop for a nightmare. You are now an observer in the sun-drenched yet increasingly tense court of King Minos at Knossos, where Daedalus, the exiled Athenian genius, plies his trade. The palace is a marvel of Minoan artistry, but a shadow is beginning to fall, a shadow cast by divine anger and a queen's unnatural desire. To understand Daedalus' ultimate dilemma and the terrible purpose for which his greatest architectural feat would be conceived, we must now turn to the tragic and frankly bizarre story of Queen Pasiphae and the birth of her monstrous son, the Minotaur. This isn't a gentle bedtime story for the faint of heart. It's a stark reminder of how in Greek mythology, a moment of human hubris or divine peak could unleash truly terrifying consequences. The trouble, as it so often does in Greek myths, began with a dispute involving the gods, specifically a broken promise to Poseidon, the mighty god of the sea, earthquakes, and horses. King Minos, to solidify his claim to the Cretan throne against his brothers, had prayed to Poseidon to send him a magnificent white bull from the sea, which Minos then vowed to sacrifice in the god's honor. Poseidon duly obliged, and a bull of dazzling, unearthly whiteness emerged from the waves, a creature of such perfect beauty and power that it left all who saw it speechless. This is a mainstream historical fact in the context of the myth. The Minotaur's conception is traditionally attributed to a divine punishment exacted by Poseidon upon King Minos, who failed to sacrifice a prized white bull sent by the god instead, substituting a lesser animal, thereby incurring Poseidon's wrath. Here's where Minos made his fatal mistake. He was so captivated by the sheer magnificence of this divine bull that he couldn't bring himself to sacrifice it as he had promised. Perhaps he thought it would make a spectacular addition to his own royal herds, a living symbol of his divine favor, or so he hoped. So he decided to keep the beautiful white bull and sacrifice another less impressive bull from his own stock in its place, hoping Poseidon wouldn't notice, or perhaps wouldn't mind. This was, to put it mildly, a terrible idea. You don't try to pull a fast one on the god of the sea, earthquakes, and impressively strong-willed bulls. It's like trying to shortchange a particularly formidable celestial tax inspector. The audit is going to be brutal. Poseidon naturally noticed, and he was not amused. His vengeance was swift, cunning, and deeply personally humiliating for Minos. The sea god didn't strike Minos down with a thunderbolt that was more Zeus's style, or drown his kingdom in a tidal wave, not immediately anyway. Instead, he inflicted a far more insidious punishment. He caused Queen Pasiphae, Minos' wife, to be consumed by an unnatural, overwhelming, and utterly irresistible passion for the beautiful white bull from the sea. This wasn't a gentle, romantic fancy. It was a divinely engineered madness, a maddening, all-consuming lust for a beast. Poor Pasiphae, a daughter of the sun god Helios and herself possessed of some divine lineage, found herself tormented by this monstrous desire. She couldn't eat, she couldn't sleep. Her every thought was consumed by the bull. And it is here that Daedalus, the royal inventor, the master craftsman, already in Minos' employ, gets drawn into this tragic and frankly rather sordid divine soap opera. Desperate and deranged by her divinely inflicted passion, Pasiphae turned to Daedalus, the man who could supposedly make anything, and begged him to devise a way for her to satisfy her unnatural longing for the bull. Now, what's a genius inventor to do when the queen, his patron's wife, comes to him with such a request? Refuse and risk her wrath and possibly the king's if she implicated him, or comply and become an accessory to an act that was clearly an abomination, a perversion of nature itself. Daedalus, perhaps out of fear or pity or maybe even a misguided application of his problem-solving skills, without fully considering the moral implications, a recurring theme for some inventors, even today, chose to comply. He constructed a cunning device, a hollow wooden cow covered with a real cowhide so perfectly lifelike that it would deceive the bull. He even mounted it on wheels so it could be moved into the pasture where the white bull grazed. Pasiphae then concealed herself inside this artificial cow, and the great white bull, duly deceived, mated with the disguised queen. It was Daedalus' ingenuity, his terrible skill, that made this unnatural union possible. One shudders to think about the workshop conversations during that particular project. More glue, nokrati, and fetch me that spare bullock's tail. This one doesn't look quite convincing enough for a discerning divine bovine. The result of this divinely cursed Daedalus-facilitated union was, as Poseidon no doubt intended, a creature of nightmare, the Minotaur. This being had the body of a man but the head and tail of a bull. He was a monstrous hybrid, a living symbol of Pasiphae's shame and Minos' hubris. As the Minotaur grew, so did his ferocity and his unnatural appetite. An appetite, according to most later versions of the myth, for human flesh. There's a quirky and rather poignant fringe tidbit that in some very early, less monstrous depictions or interpretations, the Minotaur might have simply been a title or a name, Asterion meaning starry one for a royal son of Minos. And the bull elements were perhaps symbolic or related to bull cults, before the myth evolved into its more familiar, terrifying, half-man, half-bull form. However, by the time the Labyrinth story solidifies, he is undeniably a man-eating monster. Historians still argue about the layers of meaning in the Minotaur myth. Is it a faded memory of ancient Minoan bull worship? Or bull-leaping rituals reinterpreted by later Greeks as something monstrous? Does it symbolize the subjugation of an earlier, perhaps more matriarchal, bull-centered religion by later patriarchal sky god cults? Or is it a more straightforward cautionary tale about the dangers of defying the gods and the monstrous consequences of unchecked passion and royal pride? The story certainly resonates with all these possibilities. For Daedalus, the birth of the Minotaur was a turning point. His genius had been instrumental in this terrible conception. And now this creature, this living embodiment of a divine curse, needed to be dealt with. King Minos, horrified and shamed by this monstrous stepson, yet unable or unwilling to kill a creature that was in part of divine origin, and his wife's offspring, needed a solution. He needed a place to hide the Minotaur to contain its savagery, to keep it from public view and from wreaking havoc. And once again he would turn to his most skilled, most ingenious, and perhaps now most deeply compromised servant, Daedalus. The stage was set for the engineering of the Labyrinth. You've just witnessed the horrifying culmination of Queen Pasiphae's divinely cursed passion and Daedalus's reluctant if ingenious assistance, the birth of the Minotaur, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull, a monstrous testament to King Minos's broken vow and Poseidon's terrible wrath. This half-beast, half-human offspring, a source of profound shame and fear for the Cretan king, could not be allowed to roam free. As the Minotaur grew, so did its ferocity and its unnatural craving for human flesh, turning it from a royal embarrassment into a very real threat. King Minos, faced with this monstrous reality in the heart of his sophisticated palace at Knossos, needed a solution. A way to conceal this terrible secret and contain its savage power. And for this daunting, unprecedented task, he once again summoned his most brilliant, most capable, and perhaps most morally compromised artisan, Daedalus. The king's shame was about to become the inventor's dread in the form of a truly terrifying commission. Imagine the scene: King Minos, his face a mask of regal authority, barely concealing his inner turmoil, his anger at the gods, his shame over his wife's transgression, his fear of this monstrous creature that was now his stepson. He summons Daedalus, the master craftsman whose skills had already played an unwitting, or perhaps some might argue culpably compliant role in the Minotaur's very conception by fashioning that infamous wooden cow for Pasiphae. Now Minos presents Daedalus with a new, even more challenging project. He doesn't want a beautiful statue or an intricate toy or a clever new tool. He wants a prison, but not just any prison. He needs an edifice of such bewildering complexity, such ingenious confusion that it can securely hold the Minotaur, preventing its escape, and just as importantly, keeping its existence a closely guarded secret from the wider world, or at least from casual observation. This is the mainstream historical fact underpinning the myth King Minos of Crete shamed by the birth of the Minotaur, his wife Pasiphae's monstrous offspring. Would the Cretan bull commissioned the master craftsman Daedalus to construct a vast and intricate maze, the Labyrinth, to imprison the creature. You can almost feel the chill in the air as Minos delivers his command. Daedalus, the brilliant inventor, the man who can make statues seem to live and breathe, is now being asked to use his divine-like talents to create a place of darkness, confinement, and despair. He is to engineer a structure that will be a tomb for the living. A place from which no one, not even its monstrous inhabitant, nor perhaps anyone sent within, could ever hope to find their way out. The king's words would likely be couched in terms of necessity, of protecting the kingdom, of dealing with a divine curse. But for Daedalus, the implications must have been immediately apparent. This was not a commission to be celebrated. It was a burden, a dark secret he would now share with the king. He was being asked to become the architect of a nightmare. What were his options? To refuse a direct command from a powerful and often ruthless king like Minos, especially given Daedalus's own status as an exile reliant on the king's continued favor, would have been incredibly dangerous, potentially fatal. Minos was not a ruler to be trifled with, yet to accept meant becoming complicit in the perpetual imprisonment of this creature, a creature that, while monstrous and dangerous, was also in a tragic sense innocent, a victim of divine machinations and human folly. It was also in a twisted way the grandson of his queen Pasiphae, for whom he had already performed a morally questionable service. The weight of these considerations must have been immense. You can picture Daedalus, his mind famed for its ability to solve any mechanical puzzle, now wrestling with an ethical puzzle that had no easy solution. It's like being the world's greatest software engineer and being asked to design the ultimate inescapable digital prison for a sentient AI that was only born because of a programming choice you made. The guilt would be multi-layered. There's a quirky, though perhaps anachronistic thought that Daedalus might have initially tried to propose alternative, less grim solutions. Perhaps a very strong, very remote but above-ground enclosure, or maybe some kind of magical soporific to keep the Minotaur perpetually drowsy. Your Majesty, have we considered perhaps a very large, very sturdy paddock with a nice view and maybe some calming chamomile in his, feed? But Minos likely wanted something more definitive, something that spoke of absolute containment, something that buried the shame deep. He wanted a labyrinth. The very word labyrinth carries with it connotations of bewildering complexity of paths that twist and turn, leading nowhere and everywhere at once. Historians still argue about the etymological origins of the word labyrinthos, and its connection to the Minoan double axe symbol, the labris, which was prominent in Knossos. Was the labyrinth literally the house of the double axe? Or did the term have an earlier, perhaps pre-Greek origin, signifying a complex structure? Regardless of its linguistic roots for Daedalus, the task was clear: to design something that would confuse, confound, and ultimately imprison. The king's shame demanded secrecy and an inescapable prison. The inventor's dread stemmed from the nature of the task, the monstrousness of the prisoner, and perhaps a dawning realization. that his own genius was being yoked to a dark and tragic purpose. This commission was not just an engineering challenge, it was a profound moral test and one that would haunt Daedalus for the rest of his days. The shadow of the Minotaur and the twisting passages of the prison he was about to conceive would stretch far into his future, shaping his destiny and that of his son Icarus. The dread was not just for the Minotaur, but perhaps also for himself and for the beautiful, terrible thing he was about to bring into existence. You're now standing in the heavy silence that follows King Minos's dreadful command. Daedalus, the master inventor, the man whose hands could craft unparalleled wonders, has been tasked with designing an inescapable prison for the Minotaur, his king's monstrous, bull-headed stepson. The king's shame demands concealment. The creature's ferocity demands containment. But for Daedalus, this is not merely an engineering problem to be solved with clever angles and sturdy walls. It is a profound moral maze, a true dilemma that pits his creative genius, his instinct for self-preservation, and perhaps any lingering shreds of his conscience against each other in a silent internal struggle. Imagine the thoughts racing through Daedalus's mind. He is an exile in Crete, his life and livelihood dependent on King Minos's continued favor. To openly defy such a powerful and notoriously short-tempered ruler would be tantamount to suicide, or at the very least a swift and unpleasant return to fugitive status if he could even escape the island. Minos was not known for his leniency towards those who thwarted his will, so the pragmatic self-preservationist part of Daedalus's mind would be screaming, "Just build the blasted thing and build it well, your life depends on it." It's the ancient equivalent of your boss giving you a terrible, ethically dubious project, but your mortgage payment is due and you really like having a roof over your head. Sometimes you just have to nod and get out the drawing board. Yet Daedalus was also a creator, an artist, a man whose life had been dedicated to fashioning things of beauty, utility, or wondrous ingenuity. His statues were said to be so lifelike, they had to be chained down lest they walk away. His inventions had advanced the arts of carpentry and sculpture. Now he was being asked to channel all that skill, all that divine-like talent, into creating a place of perpetual darkness, despair, and imprisonment for a living being. This is a mainstream historical fact, often emphasized in literary interpretations of the myth. Daedalus's construction of the Labyrinth is frequently portrayed not just as a feat of engineering, but as a morally complex act undertaken under duress from King Minos, which implicates the inventor in the subsequent tragic events associated with the maze and its prisoner. And what of the prisoner itself? The Minotaur, while monstrous in form and savage in nature, was not born of its own volition. It was the product of a divine curse, a consequence of Minos's hubris and Pasiphae's divinely inflicted unnatural passion. A passion that Daedalus himself had, however, reluctantly facilitated with his creation of the wooden cow. Did Daedalus feel a sliver of responsibility? A pang of guilt for the creature's very existence? Did he see in the Minotaur not just a monster to be locked away, but a tragic victim, a grotesque innocent caught in the crossfire of gods and mortals? To then design its eternal prison must have felt like compounding one transgression with another. It's like being forced to build a cage for a creature you inadvertently helped to create. The ethical knots are truly Gordian. This internal conflict, this moral maze of Mas, is central to Daedalus's dilemma. He is trapped between the king's command and his own conscience, between the demands of survival and the potential stain on his soul. If he builds the labyrinth, he becomes the architect of suffering, the jailer of a tragic beast. If he refuses, he faces the wrath of Minos, a fate likely far worse than a bad performance review. There were no HR departments or whistleblower protection laws in ancient Crete. There's a quirky, though purely speculative tidbit that Daedalus might have tried to subtly embed some form of protest or hidden meaning within the labyrinth's design itself. Perhaps certain patterns in the stonework or a specific, almost undetectable flaw in its baffling geometry known only to him served as a silent commentary on the injustice of it all, or a tiny, desperate hope for some future resolution that didn't involve perpetual imprisonment. Or maybe he just made one corridor particularly drafty and unpleasant, hoping the Minotaur would complain to Minos about the shoddy workmanship, thus getting Daedalus fired from the project. Unlikely, but a stressed inventor can dream, can't he? Historians still argue whether the character of Daedalus in the myths should be seen primarily as a tragic figure, a victim of circumstance, forced into morally compromising situations by powerful rulers, or as a more hubristic individual, a mad scientist type whose extraordinary genius was often untempered by sufficient wisdom or ethical consideration, leading to disastrous consequences like the wooden cow or later the wings of Icarus. His decision to build the labyrinth is a key exhibit in this ongoing debate. Was it reluctant compliance, or did a part of him, the pure problem solver, relish the sheer intellectual challenge of creating the ultimate, inescapable maze regardless of its purpose? As you picture Daedalus alone in his workshop sketches and plans, spread out before him, the Cretan sun casting long shadows, you can sense the turmoil. He picks up his stylus, then puts it down. He paces. He stares out at the sea, perhaps wondering if there's any escape for him, let alone for the creature he is about to entomb. This is the dilemma. His genius is his gift, his curse, and his only means of survival. To refuse the commission is death or ruin. To accept is to become an instrument of royal tyranny and to participate in the containment of a tragedy he partly helped to precipitate. The weight of this choice, the moral compromises it entailed, would inevitably shape not only the labyrinth itself, but also Daedalus's own future, pushing him further down a path that would ultimately lead him to seek his own desperate escape from Crete. The walls he was about to design would, in a way, also begin to close in on him. You're now deeply entrenched in Daedalus's profound moral and creative crisis. King Minos's command to build an inescapable prison for the Minotaur hangs heavy in the Cretan air, and our master inventor, after wrestling with his conscience and the rather pointy realities of royal displeasure, has, with a heavy heart, or perhaps a grimly focused resolve, accepted the commission. The what and why have been established. Now comes the how. How do you even begin to design a structure whose primary purpose is to utterly confound, to hopelessly ensnare any being, man or beast, that enters its depths? Daedalus, his mind a whirlwind of geometry, psychology, and perhaps a lingering dread, retreats to his workshop, the scent of cedar and clay, now mingling with the metallic tang of an unprecedented engineering challenge. It is time for the blueprint of bafflement to take shape. Imagine Daedalus, his brow furrowed, in intense concentration, surrounded by scrolls of papyrus or perhaps smooth clay tablets, his stylus flying or his charcoal sketching furiously. He wouldn't be thinking of grand colonnades or aesthetically pleasing porticos not for this project. His entire focus would be on creating disorientation, on eliminating any sense of direction, on making every choice a potential mistake. This is a mainstream historical fact often implied by the labyrinth's legendary nature. The design of the labyrinth, as attributed to Daedalus, was intended to be so complex and confusing with its multitude of winding passages, blind alleys, and identical-seeming corridors that anyone who entered without a guide or a special trick like Ariadne's thread would become hopelessly lost and unable to find the exit. His initial concepts might have drawn inspiration from the natural world. The intricate spirals of a seashell, the bewildering tunnels of an anthill, the deceptive patterns of a spider's web. Or perhaps he looked to the heavens, to the winding paths of the planets, or the complex constellations seeking a celestial geometry of confusion. He might have experimented with endless circular pathways, paths that doubled back on themselves, passages that seemed to lead to an exit but instead brought you deeper into the maze. The goal was not just physical confinement, but psychological torment. The slow erosion of hope as every attempted escape route proved to be another trick, another dead end. It was architecture as a weapon against the mind. You can picture him sketching endless variations, a series of concentric shifting walls, corridors that subtly changed their angle or width to disorient the walker, rooms that appeared identical but were slightly offset, perhaps even sections that moved or rotated, though that might be verging on later, more fantastical interpretations. He would need to consider light and shadow, using darkness and misleading shafts of light to further confuse the senses. The very air within the labyrinth might be designed to be still and oppressive, with no discernible breeze to offer a clue about direction. He wasn't just building walls. He was crafting an experience of utter soul-crushing lostness. He was trying to design a building that would actively try to make you give up. Oh, you think you found the exit, psych? That's just corridor 7B. which looks exactly like 3F, but actually leads to a broom closet and profound despair. One key principle he might have employed is the idea of multiple non-hierarchical choices. In a normal building, corridors lead to more important rooms, or staircases clearly indicate a change in level. In the Labyrinth, every turning, every junction would offer choices that seemed equally arbitrary, with no visual cues to suggest one path was more correct than another. This would quickly overwhelm the cognitive mapping abilities of anyone trapped within. After a few dozen identical-seeming turns, your internal compass would be spinning like a top in a washing machine. There's a quirky little tidbit from some interpretations of maze design that suggests Daedalus might have even incorporated subtle auditory illusions. Perhaps the sound of dripping water that seemed to come from one direction but actually originated elsewhere, or corridors that amplified or deadened footsteps in confusing ways, further unsettling the prisoner and making it impossible to retrace one's steps by sound. Or maybe he designed certain sections to have a very slight, almost imperceptible slope so that even if you thought you were walking on the level, you were actually being gently guided deeper into the maze or in a continuous disorienting circle. It's these tiny, almost subliminal tricks that would elevate his creation from a mere complex of walls to a true instrument of psychological confinement. The precise architectural form of the mythical labyrinth, whether it was a covered building, an open-air maze of high walls, or even a subterranean complex of tunnels and quadrantines, is not explicitly detailed in the earliest myths, and historians still argue about which ancient structures, if any, like the Egyptian labyrinth at Hawara, described by Herodotus, or the complex layout of Knossos itself, might have served as a partial inspiration for the legend. For Daedalus, the practical engineer, he would have had to choose a form that was constructible with Cretan resources and suitable for containing a creature as powerful as the Minotaur. He would also need to consider the user experience from the Minotaur's perspective, however grim that sounds. The creature needed to be contained, yes, but it also needed to survive at least until Minos decided otherwise, or until the Athenian tributes arrived. So there would need to be some central area where it could be fed, perhaps a source of water, and enough space for a creature of its size and strength to move however restrictedly. The labyrinth wasn't just an empty puzzle, it was also to be a monstrous den. As Daedalus refined his blueprints, the lines on the papyrus or clay would begin to coalesce into something truly bewildering. A masterpiece of intentional confusion. Each stroke of his stylus was a step further into a moral gray area, but also a testament to his unparalleled ability to manipulate space and perception. The blueprint of bafflement was taking shape, a design so fiendishly clever that it was said even Daedalus himself, upon its completion, could barely find his way out. You're now peering over Daedalus's shoulder as the final intricate designs for the labyrinth take shape on his drawing board. A bewildering masterpiece of intentional confusion. A blueprint born of royal command and the inventor's own conflicted genius. The plans are terrifyingly clever, a symphony of dead ends, false turns, and disorienting passages. But a design, however brilliant or diabolical, is merely lines on papyrus until it is given form in stone and shadow. Now begins the immense practical challenge of transforming this blueprint of bafflement into a physical reality. A task that will require vast resources, an army of laborers, and Daedalus's constant, meticulous supervision. The era of stone and sweat of dust and monumental effort has dawned in Crete. Imagine King Minos impatient to see his shameful secret safely entombed, giving Daedalus access to the royal quarries, the state treasuries, and a significant portion of the Cretan workforce. This wouldn't be a small weekend DIY project. The labyrinth, as envisioned, was to be a substantial, enduring structure capable of holding a powerful, half-bull, half-man creature for potentially a very long time. This is a mainstream historical fact often implied by the scale of the legend and the nature of Minoan monumental architecture. The construction of a structure as complex and extensive as the mythical labyrinth would have been a major feat of engineering and logistics requiring significant manpower materials. Likely stone quarried from Crete itself and sophisticated organizational skills, all of which the powerful Minoan civilization, with its palatial building experience, could theoretically provide. You can picture the scene at the chosen construction site, perhaps a secluded valley near the palace of Knossos, or even, as some later traditions suggested, a vast subterranean complex expanding upon existing caves. Armies of workmen, slaves, conscripted laborers, perhaps skilled stonemasons from across Crete, and even beyond, would begin the arduous task of quarrying and transporting massive blocks of stone. The air would fill with the rhythmic clang of hammers against chisels, the grating sound of stone being dressed, the shouts of foremen, and the creak of wooden carts or sledges hauling the heavy materials. Dust would hang thick in the Cretan sun, coating the sweating bodies of the workers. It was backbreaking, relentless labor, all in service of creating this monument to a royal secret. Daedalus, no longer just the solitary inventor in his workshop, would now be on site. The master architect overseeing every detail, ensuring his complex, disorienting design was translated accurately into unyielding stone. He would need to instruct the foremen and masons with extreme care. The very nature of the labyrinth demanded that its internal logic remain opaque, even to those building it. Perhaps he divided the construction into sections, with different teams working on different parts, none of them ever seeing the complete master plan. Or maybe he employed deliberately confusing or contradictory instructions, ensuring that no single worker could ever grasp the overall pattern of the maze. He had to build a structure that even its builders couldn't navigate. It's like trying to get a group of people to assemble the world's most complicated IKEA flat-pack furniture, but without the instruction manual in a foreign language, and with the added pressure that if they figure it out, a Minotaur might eat them. Or worse, King Minos might. The foundations would be laid deep and strong to support the massive stone walls. Then, course by course, the bewildering passages would begin to rise. Corridors that twisted unexpectedly, chambers that led only to other identical chambers, staircases that spiraled down into darkness, only to lead back to where they began. Daedalus would be there, checking angles, ensuring the precise alignment of each deceptive turn, the careful placement of each false doorway. His mind, which had conceived this intricate puzzle, now had to ensure its flawless execution. The scent of cut stone, wet mortar, and the sweat of countless laborers would have been the perfume of this creation. There's a quirky, though entirely speculative, thought that Daedalus might have incorporated some of his earlier inventions or mechanical skills into the labyrinth's construction. Perhaps certain sections had cleverly hidden counterweighted moving walls that could shift to alter pathways, or floors that tilted almost imperceptibly to guide an unwary wanderer further into confusion. Or maybe he designed specific acoustic properties into some corridors, so that the Minotaur's roars would echo in a particularly terrifying and disorienting way, adding to the psychological torment of anyone or anything trapped within. While the myths don't typically detail such specific mechanical traps, it's well within the character of Daedalus, the master of Atum, Mata, and cunning devices to have added a few extra layers of engineered despair to his creation. Historians still argue about the possible real-world inspirations for the Labyrinth legend, often pointing to the complex, multi-roomed, and seemingly maze-like floor plan of the actual Palace of Knossos. Could the Labyrinth have been a specific, particularly confusing section of the palace itself, or a nearby structure whose ruins later fueled the myth? Or was it inspired by ancient Egyptian funerary complexes, which often had intricate internal passages designed to protect the pharaoh's tomb? The construction of the labyrinth in the myth would have drawn upon the real building practices and capabilities of the Bronze Age Aegean world, even as its purpose and design were fantastical. As the walls rose higher and the shadows within grew deeper, a sense of awe and perhaps unease would have spread among the workers and the wider Cretan populace, or at least those who caught wind of this strange, secretive project. What was this vast, windowless, bewildering structure being built for? Rumors would undoubtedly have circulated. But Daedalus, under the strict orders of Minos, would have ensured that the true purpose and the true horror of its intended occupant remained a closely guarded secret. The sweat and stone were not just building a maze, they were building a wall of silence around a monstrous truth. And Daedalus, the architect of it all, was at the very center of that monumental, dusty, and increasingly dark endeavor. You're now witnessing the monumental effort of the labyrinth's construction stone by heavy stone under the Cretan sun. Armies of laborers toil, dust fills the air, and Daedalus, the master architect, moves among them. His mind a whirlwind of complex calculations, and perhaps a growing sense of unease. The outer shell of this vast, bewildering prison is taking shape. But the true genius of the labyrinth, the thing that will make it truly inescapable, lies not just in its scale or the solidity of its walls, but in the subtle, insidious architectural tricks Daedalus is weaving into its very fabric. The illusory walls, the shifting paths, the carefully engineered confusion designed to break the spirit as much as to confine the body. As Daedalus oversees the placement of each corridor, each turning, each seemingly identical chamber, he is not merely building. He is crafting an experience of profound disorientation. One of his key strategies would be the deliberate elimination of any reliable landmarks or points of reference. In a normal building, you can orient yourself by a prominent doorway, a distinctive window, a change in decoration. But within the labyrinth, Daedalus would ensure that long stretches of passage looked exactly the same. The same rough-hewn stone walls, the same oppressive low ceilings, the same dim, flickering torchlight, if any light was permitted in the deeper sections, casting identical dancing shadows. After a few turns, every corridor would begin to look like the one you just left and the one before that. Your mind would desperately seek a pattern, a differentiating feature, but find only maddening repetition. This is a mainstream historical concept often associated with labyrinthine design. The effectiveness of a maze like the Labyrinth lies in its ability to disorient by creating numerous identical or near-identical branching pathways. Dead ends and loops overwhelming the navigator's ability to form a mental map or rely on memory. Daedalus might also employ subtle, almost imperceptible changes in gradient or direction. A corridor might appear to be straight, but in fact curve very gently so that over a long distance, you would be unknowingly turned back upon yourself. Or a floor might have a barely noticeable slope guiding you downwards into deeper, more confusing levels, without you even realizing you were descending. These were not dramatic Escher-like impossibilities, but tiny, insidious deceptions that would cumulatively erode your sense of direction and your confidence in your own perceptions. It's like those frustrating dreams where you're trying to get somewhere familiar, but every street you take looks right but feels wrong, and you just get more and more lost. Daedalus was building that dream in stone. False doors and blind alleys would be fundamental components of his design. Imagine reaching what looks like a promising exit, a doorway that seems to lead to freedom, only to find it opens onto a solid stone wall, or worse, another identical bewildering passage. Or taking a turn that feels like progress, only to find yourself at a dead end, forced to retrace your steps through corridors that all look infuriatingly alike, your hope dwindling with each frustrating backtrack. He might even design passages that spiraled inwards or sections that were built as mirror images of each other, further scrambling any attempt to create a mental map. The labyrinth wasn't just a physical structure, it was a psychological weapon. It was designed to make you doubt your own senses, your own memory, your own sanity. There's a quirky and rather clever tidbit that Daedalus might have considered the play of light and shadow, not just for disorientation, but for creating illusory effects. Perhaps narrow, high-set slits allowed shafts of sunlight or moonlight, if parts were open to the sky, to penetrate at certain angles, creating fleeting patterns on the walls that seemed to suggest openings or pathways where none existed. Or deep shadows in corners might conceal a true turning, while a more brightly lit but ultimately false passage beckoned. He could have used contrasting textures of stone to subtly guide or misguide the touch if a prisoner were trying to feel their way in darkness. He wasn't just an architect, he was an illusionist, a master of perceptual trickery. He was probably the only contractor in history whose main deliverable was utter soul-crushing confusion. The very sounds within the labyrinth, or the lack thereof, could also be part of the design. Long, empty corridors might create unnerving echoes, making every footstep sound like a legion or like something monstrous approaching. Other sections might be designed to absorb sound, creating an oppressive tomb-like silence that would prey on the nerves. The distant, terrifying roars of the Minotaur itself, echoing unpredictably through the twisting passages, would serve as a constant, horrifying reminder of what lay at the maze's heart and what awaited anyone who became truly lost. Historians still argue whether the labyrinth, as described in myth, was conceived as a two-dimensional maze like a garden hedge maze, but with high walls, or a more complex three-dimensional structure with multiple levels, ramps, and staircases leading up and down into deeper confusion. Given Daedalus's reputation for three-dimensional artistry like his moving statues, a multi-level design, perhaps partly subterranean, would certainly be within his conceptual grasp and would offer even greater possibilities for bewildering complexity. Imagine staircases that led nowhere or ramps that circled back to previous levels without any clear indication. As Daedalus supervised the masons, instructing them on the precise angle of a wall, The deceptive curve of a corridor, the placement of a blind archway, he would be holding the master key to this stone puzzle in his mind. He was creating a system of ordered chaos, a perfectly engineered prison of the mind as much as of the body. Each stone laid was not just part of a wall, but part of an elaborate, inescapable deception designed to ensure that its monstrous occupant and anyone else unfortunate enough to enter would wander its passages in perpetual, hopeless confusion. You're now deep within the conceptual and early construction phases of Daedalus's most infamous creation, the Labyrinth. You've seen him meticulously planning its bewildering array of illusory walls, shifting paths, and psychologically unnerving dead ends. The primary goal is, of course, to confuse and contain any who enter to make escape an impossibility. But at the very center of this architectural enigma, there must be a place for the labyrinth's primary and truly terrifying occupant, the Minotaur. Daedalus therefore couldn't just design an empty puzzle. He had to consider the nature of the beast he was imprisoning and create a space, a den, a monstrous heart within the maze where the Minotaur could live, however miserably, and from which it could not under any circumstances break free. As Daedalus sketched out the spiraling deceptive corridors that would lead ever inwards, his thoughts must have turned to this central chamber. What would it need to be? Firstly, it would need to be incredibly secure. The Minotaur was a creature of immense strength, half bull, with all the primal fury that implied. Its prison couldn't be a flimsy affair of ordinary walls. Daedalus would have had to envision immensely thick stone, perhaps reinforced in some way with no obvious weaknesses, no points of leverage that a desperate raging beast could exploit. The very foundations of the central den would need to be unshakable. This is a key, though often unstated, implication of the myth. The central chamber of the labyrinth, designed to house the Minotaur, would have required exceptional strength and security features, beyond even the confusing nature of the surrounding maze to contain such a powerful and ferocious creature. The size of the chamber would also be a consideration. While the aim was imprisonment, the Minotaur was still a living creature, a stepson of the king, however monstrous. It couldn't be kept in a tiny, cramped cell indefinitely if it was to survive, and Minos presumably wanted it to survive at least initially as a terrible secret, and perhaps later as a tool of punishment for his enemies like the unfortunate Athenian tributes. So the central area likely had to be spacious enough for the Minotaur to move to turn, perhaps even to charge a short distance, expending some of its restless, aggressive energy without being able to shatter its confines. You can almost picture Daedalus calculating the minimum turning radius of an enraged bullman, a rather niche architectural problem, if ever there was one. Right, if he does a full pirouette of fury, we'll need at least this much clearance, otherwise he'll take out a load-bearing pillar, and that's just bad for everyone's property values. What about light and air? Would the Minotaur's den be plunged into perpetual Stygian darkness, adding to its torment and perhaps making it even more savage? Or would Daedalus, perhaps out of some lingering sliver of pity, or for more practical reasons of maintenance, however, that was envisioned, design some very high, inaccessible light shafts or ventilation opening? These would have to be incredibly secure, positioned in such a way that they offered no hint of an escape route, no glimpse of the outside world that might fuel a desperate attempt to break free. Perhaps the light was merely the dim, flickering glow of torches placed in recessed, unreachable niches, casting long, terrifying shadows that would make the Minotaur itself seem even more monstrous. And then there was the grim matter of sustenance. The Minotaur, in its most fearsome iterations, craved human flesh, while the regular tribute of Athenian youths and maidens was a later development. In the myth, after the labyrinth was built, the creature still needed to be fed something in its prison. How was this to be accomplished? Without endangering the feeders and without providing an opportunity for escape, Daedalus would have had to design a secure feeding mechanism, perhaps a chute from above, or a heavily barred opening through which food could be passed. It's a chilling design consideration how to safely deliver dinner to a man-eating monster you've just locked away in the heart of an inescapable maze. Not your typical catering challenge. There's a quirky and rather dark thought that Daedalus might have designed the Minotaur's central chamber with specific acoustic properties, not to soothe the beast with calming echoes. Oh no. But perhaps to amplify its terrifying roars and bellows, making them reverberate through the entire labyrinth, a constant reminder to anyone lost within its passages of the monstrous presence awaiting them at its core. It would be an auditory reinforcement of the maze's terror. Imagine being hopelessly lost and then hearing that unearthly guttural roar, seemingly coming from all directions at once. It would be enough to break even the strongest spirit. Historians still argue about whether the center of the labyrinth in the myth was conceived as a single fixed chamber, or if the Minotaur was imagined to roam through a larger, but still contained, central section of the maze. Some ancient depictions on coined mines or pottery show the labyrinth as a smallest spiral leading to a central point, while others suggest a more complex, multi-branched structure where the center might be less clearly defined a region rather than a room. Daedalus, aiming for maximum security and confusion, might have even designed a central area that was itself a mini-maze with several interconnected chambers, so that even if the Minotaur broke out of one part, it would still be trapped within a larger, more complex or whatever its precise layout. This heart of the maze, the Minotaur's designated chamber, would be the ultimate destination for anyone or anything unfortunate enough to be cast into the labyrinth. It had to be a place of absolute containment, a dead end from which there was no return. A place where the monster could be both hidden and held. Daedalus, the master craftsman, would have poured all his ingenuity into making this core not just strong, but also a reflection of the despair and hopelessness that the labyrinth was meant to embody. It was the dark jewel at the center of his terrifyingly beautiful and beautifully terrifying creation. You are now witnessing the culmination of Daedalus's dark commission. The twisting passages are being laid, the illusory walls are rising, and at the very heart of this stone puzzle, a monstrous den is being prepared for the Minotaur. King Minos, no doubt, is watching the progress with a mixture of grim satisfaction and perhaps a touch of royal impatience. But for Daedalus, the master engineer, the task isn't complete simply when the last stone is set. He needs to be absolutely certain that his creation, this labyrinth, is truly inescapable, not just for its bull-headed occupant, but for any human who might dare or be forced to enter its depth. How would he test such a unique and terrifyingly complex design? This wasn't like testing a new type of aqueduct where if it leaks a bit, you just patch it up. The stakes here were considerably higher. Once the main structure was complete, with its myriad corridors, blind alleys, and intentionally confusing junctions, Daedalus would need some way to verify its efficacy. He couldn't very well ask for volunteers to just pop in and see if you can find your way out before lunchtime, there's a good chap. The first and most obvious test subject would, in a grim sense, be the Minotaur itself once it was finally lured or driven into its central chamber and sealed within the surrounding maze. Its inevitable furious attempts to escape would provide a very real-world stress test of the labyrinth's physical strength and its psychological power to confound. Daedalus would likely observe from a safe distance or through carefully concealed spy holes how the creature reacted, which paths it took, where it became most confused or enraged. This is a chilling but logical implication of the myth. The primary test of the labyrinth's inescapability would be its ability to successfully contain the Minotaur itself over time. But what about for a human intellect, Daedalus being the designer, would in theory know its secrets? Yet the legends often say that the labyrinth was so complex that even Daedalus himself could barely find his way out after its completion. This suggests he might have deliberately incorporated elements of randomness, or made the final connections in such a way that even his own perfect knowledge of the blueprint was challenged. Perhaps he had his workers seal certain passages or open others based on a chance system, or introduced last-minute changes that even he hadn't fully mapped all to ensure its ultimate impenetrability. It's like a software developer adding a few lines of deliberately obfuscated code that even they will struggle to debug later, just to prove a point about complexity. I'm so clever, Amaya. He might think I've almost outsmarted myself, which, come to think of it, might be a problem later if Minos decides I'm the next one to test the facilities. Beyond the Minotaur were there other tests. The most famous story associated with navigating the labyrinth involves Theseus and Ariadne's thread, which comes later after the maze is established as a place of sacrifice for Athenian youths. But in its initial stages before it became a place of regular human doom, how did Minos and Daedalus satisfy themselves of its human-proof nature? Perhaps unfortunate slaves or prisoners of war were sent in their fates, serving as grim data points in Daedalus's ongoing quality assurance process. The myths are generally silent on such grim preliminaries, focusing more on the final terrifying purpose of the maze. There's a quirky, though rather dark fringe idea that Daedalus might have created a scale model of the labyrinth, first a kind of ancient Greek architectural dollhouse of despair. He could have then used small animals like mice or ants to test pathway configurations, observing how they navigated or failed to navigate its complexities before committing to the full-scale stone construction. It's a slightly less horrifying thought than using human test subjects, though probably not much comfort to the mice who never found the tiny cheese-baited exit. Look, Mino Subject 7B, a rather intelligent field mouse, has been wandering in circles for 3 hours now. I think we can confidently say the northwestern quadrant is optimally bewildering. It's also possible that Daedalus relied on pure mathematical and geometric principles to ensure its inescapability. He was, after all, a master of such arts. He might have used specific algorithms or design rules known only to him that guaranteed a certain level of navigational difficulty, a certain number of false paths per true one, a precise ratio of disorientation to hope. The labyrinth could have been less a randomly tangled mess and more a perfectly calculated engine of confusion, its terrifying effectiveness rooted in its cold, hard geometry. Historians still argue whether the inescapability of the mythical labyrinth was meant to be absolute, or if it was simply so difficult to navigate that escape was highly improbable without divine aid, or a clever trick like Ariadne's thread. Was it a perfect prison, or just an exceedingly good one? The difference is subtle but significant. A perfect prison implies a kind of flawless, almost magical design. An exceedingly good one acknowledges the possibility of human ingenuity, or a helpful princess with a ball of string eventually finding a flaw. The ultimate test, in a way, would be Daedalus's own lingering fear of it. If the creator himself felt a chill of apprehension when contemplating its depths, if even he, holding the master plan in his mind, felt a moment's doubt about his ability to easily walk its paths, then he would know he had succeeded. The structure had to be more than just walls and corridors. It had to possess an aura of baffling, soul-crushing complexity. It needed to radiate a sense of inescapable doom. And as the final stones were laid, and the shadows within deepened into a permanent twilight, Daedalus must have looked upon his work with a mixture of pride in his unparalleled skill and a dawning, terrible understanding of what he had truly unleashed upon Crete and perhaps upon his own future. The unnavigable design was complete, and its first most important prisoner, the Minotaur, awaited its installation in the dark heart of the maze. The dust of construction has finally settled. The last stone has been laid, the last deceptive corridor artfully angled by Daedalus's skilled hand. The labyrinth stands complete, a silent, brooding enigma under the Cretan sun, or perhaps more fittingly already sinking into the shadowy gloom of its intended subterranean or deeply enclosed existence. King Minos has faced a mixture of grim satisfaction and perhaps a lingering horror. The necessity of such a creation comes to inspect this dark marvel, this architectural solution to his monstrous family secret. And you, alongside Daedalus, witness the unveiling of a structure that would inspire both awe and terror for millennia to come. Imagine King Minos approaching the entrance to the labyrinth. There are no grand, welcoming porticos here, no inviting colonnades. The entrance itself might be deliberately unassuming, or perhaps forbiddingly stark, a simple dark opening in a vast windowless wall that gives no hint of the bewildering complexity within. Or maybe it's a grand, intimidating gateway designed to cow anyone forced to enter. This is a mainstream historical interpretation, derived from the myth. The labyrinth, as conceived by Daedalus for King Minos, was not intended as a place of beauty or public display, but as a functional and terrifying prison, its exterior likely reflecting its grim purpose, designed to be disorienting and inescapable from the moment one crossed its threshold. As Minos and his retinue, and perhaps a very reluctant Daedalus who might be thinking, I really hope he doesn't ask for a personal guided tour right now, peer into the gloom, they would be met with the first of its many deceptions. A choice of paths seemingly identical leading off into darkness. The air from within might be still and cool, carrying perhaps a faint, unsettling earthy scent, or maybe if the Minotaur had already been installed, a distant bestial odor and the faint, terrifying echo of a monstrous growl. The king would likely demand assurances from Daedalus that this structure was indeed as inescapable as promised. Daedalus, with the heavy weight of his creation settling upon him, would have to affirm its terrible perfection. He might explain some of its principles: the endless identical turnings, the blind alleys, the lack of any orienting features. all designed to ensure that once the Minotaur was within its central den, it would never find its way out. And by grim extension, neither would any human offering sent in to meet their doom. The completion of the Labyrinth would have been a momentous occasion in Crete, though one likely shrouded in secrecy and fear among the general populace. Whispers of this strange, vast, and terrifying structure being built for some dark royal purpose would have circulated. What was it for? What monstrous thing did it hide? The very mystery surrounding it would amplify its horror. It wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of a royal shame so profound it had to be buried in a stone puzzle, a testament to a divine curse that haunted the ruling house of Knossos. It was a dark marvel indeed, a masterpiece of engineering, dedicated to a horrifying purpose. The people of Crete probably gave its location a very wide berth, and mothers likely used tales of it to frighten naughty children into obedience. Be good, or King Minos will send Daedalus to build a tiny labyrinth under your bed. There's a quirky, though grim tidbit from some later interpretations and artistic depictions of the labyrinth that shows the discarded bones of previous victims scattered within its passages. While this is more a feature of the labyrinth as active place of sacrifice phase after the Athenian tribute is established, the very thought of such remains even before they existed would have been part of its terrifying aura from the moment of its completion. Daedalus might have even designed certain alcoves or chambers where such grim trophies could accumulate unseen by the outside world, adding to the despair of anyone lost within. It's a chilling thought, architecture designed to accommodate future horror. King Minos' reaction upon seeing the finished labyrinth would likely be complex. Relief certainly that his monstrous stepson could now be securely contained, his shame hidden from the public eye. Perhaps a grudging admiration for Daedalus' unparalleled genius in creating such a bewilderingly effective prison. But also maybe a touch of fear. A structure so perfectly designed to imprison could in itself be a dangerous secret. And the man who designed it? Daedalus now knew that secret intimately. This might have been the moment when Minos began to see Daedalus not just as a valuable artisan, but as a potential liability, someone who knew too much. Historians still argue about the labyrinth's supposed location and its relationship to the actual palace of Knossos. Was it a literal, separate structure, or did the term labyrinth become metaphorically attached to the incredibly complex multi-roomed layout of Knossos itself, which to later Greeks unfamiliar with its design might have seemed like an inescapable maze? The archaeological excavations at Knossos have revealed a vast palace with winding corridors, numerous rooms in different levels, but no single structure that definitively matches the mythical labyrinth designed for a single monstrous occupant. The truth likely lies in a combination of historical memory of the impressive Minoan palace and later Greek mythological elaboration. But for Daedalus standing there beside his completed masterpiece of despair, the labyrinth was all too real. He had poured his genius into its creation, solved the king's impossible problem, and in doing so had perhaps sealed his own fate. The labyrinth was complete, a dark marvel that awed and horrified in equal measure, a stone testament to a terrible secret, and a prison that would soon hold more than just the Minotaur within its bewildering embrace. The labyrinth is complete. You can almost hear the final echoing clang as the last heavy stone as if such there was grinds shut, sealing the Minotaur within the bewildering, inescapable heart of Daedalus' dark masterpiece. King Minos is perhaps momentarily satisfied, his monstrous shame now securely hidden from the world, contained within a prison of unparalleled ingenuity. A collective sigh of relief, tinged with lingering fear, might ripple through the royal court at Knossos. But for Daedalus, the brilliant architect of this terrifying solution, the sense of completion is likely far from comforting. As he looks upon his creation, this monument to his own genius and to a king's dark secret, a chilling realization must begin to dawn in designing a perfect prison for the Minotaur he has, in a very real sense, also begun to construct the walls of his own gilded cage. The inventor is now trapped by his own art and by the dangerous knowledge he possesses. Imagine Daedalus, his official commission fulfilled, perhaps receiving some measure of royal praise or at least a grudging nod of approval from Minos. He might even be rewarded with gold or honors, but these would be cold comfort. He is now the man who knows the secret of the labyrinth's design. He knows its twists, its turns, its false paths, its hidden heart. He is the only one apart from perhaps Minos himself, if Daedalus even shared the full true plan with the king, who holds the key to its unfathomable complexity. And this knowledge in the court of a powerful and often ruthless ruler like Minos is not a source of power for Daedalus. It is a profound liability. This is a key theme in many versions of the myth. Daedalus, having created the Labyrinth for King Minos, subsequently finds himself and his son Icarus effectively imprisoned on Crete by the king, who is unwilling to let such a skilled artisan privy to so many royal secrets, including the Labyrinth's design and the truth of the Minotaur, leave his service and potentially divulge this sensitive information elsewhere. Minos, while perhaps grateful for the solution to his Minotaur problem, would also recognize the danger Daedalus now represents. What if Daedalus, with his Athenian loyalties or a troubled conscience, were to reveal the Labyrinth's secrets to Minos' enemies? What if he were to build another such structure for a rival king? Or what if he simply decided to leave Crete, taking his unparalleled inventive genius with him? Minos, a ruler known for his possessiveness and his desire to control all aspects of his kingdom, would not easily countenance such a loss or such a risk. The Labyrinth therefore becomes not just a prison for the Minotaur, but an invisible chain binding Daedalus ever more tightly to Crete and to the king's service. He built it to keep something in, but its very existence now keeps him in as well. It's the ultimate ironic twist the master of escape routes has designed his own inescapable situation. He's like a brilliant cybersecurity expert who designs an unhackable system for a paranoid dictator, only to realize he's now too valuable and knows too many backdoors to ever be allowed to resign and go work for the competition, or even just retire to a quiet life of inventing less morally compromising self-stirring spoons. You can picture Daedalus, his initial task completed, trying to return to his other work, perhaps to his family life with his wife Naukriti and his young son Icarus. But the shadow of the Labyrinth and the knowledge it contains would always be there. He might find himself under closer royal scrutiny, his movements monitored, his requests to travel perhaps politely but firmly denied. The gilded cage of royal patronage, which once offered him refuge and opportunity after his exile from Athens, now begins to feel more like a beautifully appointed but nonetheless secure prison cell. His genius, once a source of fame and freedom, has become the very thing that curtails his liberty. There's a quirky little psychological tidbit to consider. Here perhaps Daedalus himself became somewhat obsessed with or even haunted by his own creation. Did he find himself mentally retracing its paths at night, wondering if there was some tiny flaw he'd overlooked? Some secret way out that even he hadn't consciously designed, but that his subconscious had embedded? Or did the sheer act of conceiving and building something so profoundly disorienting have a subtle, unsettling effect on his own mind? The creator becoming subtly shaped by his creation. He might find himself noticing maze-like patterns in everyday things, the cracks in a dried mudflat, the flight of birds, the arrangement of stars. His mind forever caught in the labyrinth's coils. Historians still argue about the exact nature of Daedalus's imprisonment in Crete before his famous flight. Was it a literal physical confinement ordered by Minos, or a more subtle but equally effective form of detention through royal command surveillance and the withholding of permission to leave the island? The myths vary, with some suggesting Minos explicitly forbade him from departing, while others imply a more nuanced situation, where Daedalus simply knew that attempting to leave without the king's blessing would be met with dire consequences. The result, however, was the same: he was trapped. The labyrinth stands as a constant brooding reminder of his situation. Every time he sees its presumably featureless outer walls or hears a distant, muffled roar from within, it underscores his own predicament. He has solved Minos' problem, but in doing so, he has created a new and far more personal one for himself. The master craftsman, the man who could build wings for statues and make them move, now finds his own wings clipped by the very king he serves, and by the terrible, inescapable knowledge locked within the stone heart of his own dark marvel. The dilemma has shifted. It's no longer about whether to build the labyrinth, but how to escape its far-reaching consequences and the increasingly watchful eyes of King Minos. You are now standing with Daedalus in the long, oppressive shadow cast by his own monstrous creation, the Labyrinth. He has solved King Minos' terrible problem, entombing the Minotaur in a masterpiece of bewildering architecture, but in doing so, he has found himself a prisoner of sorts bound to Crete by the king's will and the dangerous secrets he now possesses. The labyrinth, that dark marvel, is complete, and its influence, its very idea, begins to seep out, not just into the consciousness of Crete, but into the wider world of myth, art, and human thought, leaving an indelible mark that twists and turns through the centuries, much like its own enigmatic passages. The immediate legacy of the labyrinth in Crete within the context of the myth was one of terror and tribute. Once the Minotaur was securely housed King Minos in his wrath against Athens, for the earlier death of his son, Androgeos imposed a horrifying tax every 9 years. Or some say every year Athens was forced to send 7 young men and 7 young women as tribute to be sacrificed to the Minotaur by being sent into the labyrinth, from which of course none were expected to return. This is a mainstream historical fact within the mythological narrative. The labyrinth, after its construction by Daedalus, becomes the site for the human sacrifices demanded by King Minos from Athens, with these youths and maidens being sent into the maze to be devoured by the Minotaur, a key element leading to Theseus's later quest. The labyrinth therefore transforms from a secret prison for a royal shame into a very public instrument of Cretan power and Athenian suffering. Its twisting passages now echoed not just with the roars of the Minotaur, but with the despair of its human victims. But beyond its grim function in the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur, the labyrinth as an idea, as a symbol, began to take on a life of its own. The very concept of a structure so complex that it was virtually impossible to navigate without a trick or divine aid captured the human imagination. It became a potent metaphor for any bewildering or inescapable situation, for a journey fraught with confusion and dead ends, whether physical, intellectual, or spiritual. We still speak of navigating a labyrinth of bureaucracy or being lost in a labyrinth of despair. Daedalus's stone puzzle became an archetype. You can see echoes of its design and its power in various forms of art and thought throughout history. The image of the labyrinth, often depicted as a unicursal single-path spiral leading to a center in earlier representations, or as a more complex multicursal many-branched maze, in later ones appeared on Cretan coins and mosaics on Roman floors. In medieval church pavements where walking, it might symbolize a pilgrimage or a spiritual journey, and in Renaissance garden designs. Each culture reinterpreted it, but the core idea of a challenging transformative path remained. The twisting passages Daedalus engineered became a blueprint for countless other mazes, both real and metaphorical. It's as if Daedalus didn't just build one labyrinth, he unleashed the very idea of labyrinthness into the world. He probably didn't get royalties for all those garden mazes, which is a shame. The labyrinth also represents the ultimate intellectual puzzle, a challenge to human ingenuity to solve. The fact that its own creator, Daedalus, was said to have barely been able to escape it in some versions of the tale only added to its mystique. It became a symbol of a problem so complex it borders on the divine or the diabolical. This fascination with its insolubility is paradoxically what makes it so endlessly fascinating. We are drawn to puzzles we can't easily solve, to mysteries that resist easy answers. There's a quirky little tidbit that some ancient philosophers and mystics saw the labyrinth not just as a place of terror, but as a symbol of initiation, a sacred space for a transformative journey. To enter the labyrinth, face the monster at its center, whether a literal minotaur or a metaphorical inner demon, and then find one's way out again, was to undergo a kind of death and rebirth, emerging wiser and stronger. In this light, Daedalus wasn't just building a prison. He was unintentionally creating a powerful, if terrifying, arena for spiritual testing. It's unlikely King Minos was thinking along those lines. When he commissioned it, he probably just wanted the bull-headed embarrassment kept quiet. But myths have a wonderful way of accumulating deeper meanings over time. Historians still argue about the true origins and symbolic evolution of the labyrinth motif itself. Does it predate the Cretan myth of Daedalus and the Minotaur, perhaps having roots in prehistoric cave markings, ancient sun symbols, or ritual dance patterns found across many cultures? Or did the powerful Cretan story popularize and codify a more diffuse ancient symbol? It's a classic chicken and egg, or perhaps Minotaur and maze question in the study of ancient symbolism. The Labyrinth of Knossos, whether a historical reality or a purely mythical construct inspired by the palace, became the definitive archetypal labyrinth for the Western world. For Daedalus, however, this burgeoning legacy would have been cold comfort. While his creation was on its way to becoming an immortal symbol, he himself remained a captive, his genius now a source of his confinement. The twisting passages he had so cleverly designed to hold another now seemed to mock his own predicament. He had built a masterpiece of engineering, a structure that would be talked about for millennia, but in doing so, he had also laid the stones of his own gilded prison, the echoes of its construction. The memory of its dark purpose and the ever-present threat of King Minos' displeasure would all contribute to his growing desperation. A desperation that would soon cause him to look to the skies for an escape route even more audacious than the labyrinth itself. You are now standing with Daedalus in the lengthening shadows of his own reputation in Crete. The labyrinth, his dark and bewildering masterpiece, is complete. It successfully contains the monstrous Minotaur, and its legend is already beginning to twist its way into the consciousness of the Aegean world. A symbol of royal power, divine wrath, and terrifying ingenuity, King Minos, while perhaps pleased with the solution to his monstrous problem, is also keenly aware that the man who designed such an inescapable prison, the man who knows its every secret passage and fiendish trick, is too valuable and potentially too dangerous to ever be allowed to leave his service. Daedalus, the master inventor, finds himself admired, feared, and effectively imprisoned on the island, his genius having forged the very chains that now bind him. It is out of this gilded cage, this suffocating royal patronage, that the first desperate flutters of an idea for escape will begin to take wing, leading to his most famous and ultimately most tragic invention. Imagine Daedalus sometime after the labyrinth's completion. He continues to serve King Minos, perhaps designing other marvels, overseeing other constructions, but the unspoken truth of his captivity hangs heavy in the Cretan air. He might have a comfortable life, material wealth, the respect, or at least the cautious deference of the court, but he is not free. He cannot return to his beloved Athens, nor can he take his unparalleled skills to another kingdom. He is Minos' prized possession, as much a part of the king's collection of wonders as any exotic beast in the royal menagerie. This is a key element of the myth leading to his next great endeavor. Daedalus, despite his usefulness to King Minos, eventually grows desperate to escape the island of Crete, particularly as he fears the king's increasingly tyrannical nature, or wishes to return to his homeland but finds all terrestrial and sea routes barred to him by Minos' decree. His son, Icarus, is growing up in this Cretan court, perhaps unaware of the full extent of his father's past sorrows or present predicament, but likely sensing the underlying tension, the unspoken constraints. For Daedalus, the desire to escape is not just for himself, but for his son too, to give Icarus a future beyond the shores of Minos' oppressive domain. The labyrinth, in a way, becomes the ultimate symbol of his entrapment. He who could design a structure to confuse all others now finds himself in a larger societal labyrinth from which there seems no conventional exit. The sea which brought him to Crete is now a barrier patrolled by Minos' fleet. The land routes are equally closed to him. It is in this state of frustrated genius, of yearning for freedom, that Daedalus' inventive mind would naturally turn to the one remaining avenue of escape: the sky. If land and sea are barred, then perhaps the air itself could offer a pathway to liberty. You can picture him observing the flight of birds, the gulls soaring effortlessly over the Cretan cliffs, the eagles riding the thermal currents. Their freedom, their ability to transcend earthly boundaries, must have seemed like a tantalizing promise. He, Daedalus, the man who could make statues walk, who could build a maze to confound a monster. Surely he could find a way to conquer the air itself? It was an audacious thought, a desperate hope, but for a mind like Daedalus's, the impossible was often just an engineering challenge waiting to be solved. Right, he might have muttered to himself, gazing at a swooping swallow. Feathers, lightweight frame, aerodynamic principles. And a distinct lack of a grumpy king trying to keep you grounded. There's an idea there. The labyrinth? His most complex earthly creation was all about confinement, about looking inwards, about descent into darkness and confusion. His next great project, born from the desire to escape that very confinement, would be its complete antithesis. It would be about ascent, about soaring outwards, about reaching for the sunlit freedom of the open sky. The seeds of the wings of Icarus are sown in the despair and frustration, engendered by the successful completion and inescapable implications of the labyrinth. There's a quirky little tidbit that some interpretations of the myth suggest. Daedalus began his experiments with flight by studying the way wind caught a sail. Another of his supposed inventions are the mechanics of bird wings with an almost obsessive scientific focus. He might have collected feathers of all sizes, studied their structure, their lightness, their strength. He might have spent hours watching birds in flight, sketching their wing movements, trying to decipher the secrets of their aerial mastery. It wouldn't just be a sudden flash of inspiration. It would be the methodical application of his inventive genius to a seemingly insurmountable problem. He wasn't just building a pair of wings, he was reverse engineering avian flight for human application, a truly Herculean or perhaps Daedalian task. Historians still argue about the deeper symbolic meaning of Daedalus's eventual flight. Is it a metaphor for the artist's creative escape from patronage or societal constraints? Is it a tale about the human aspiration to transcend limitations? Or a cautionary story about the dangers of hubris and unnatural ambition, especially through the fate of Icarus? Whatever its many layers within the narrative of Daedalus's life, the desire for flight is a direct consequence of his Cretan experience, an experience dominated and defined by the shadow of the Labyrinth and the possessiveness of King Minos. The Labyrinth in its dark perfection had served its purpose for the king, but for its creator, it became a catalyst. It proved his genius, yes, but it also highlighted his vulnerability and his lack of true freedom. The man who could trap a monster found himself trapped. And so as he looked out from the shores of Crete, perhaps towards his distant homeland of Athens, his gaze would increasingly turn upwards to the boundless, unregulated expanse of the sky. The dilemma of the labyrinth was about to give way to the daring, desperate dream of flight. And so the tale of Daedalus and the intricate, morally fraught engineering of the Minotaur's labyrinth draws to its earthly close. We have walked with him through the corridors of his genius, his guilt, and his growing desire for freedom. The great shadowy maze stands as a testament to his unparalleled skill, but also as a symbol of the complex burdens that can accompany extraordinary talent when placed in the service of power. The roars of the Minotaur, now safely, or so it seems, contained within its bewildering walls, fade into the background, replaced by the quieter, more personal hum of Daedalus's own restless mind, already contemplating a new, even more audacious project. The Cretan sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows from the palace of Knossos and the unseen labyrinth itself. The Mediterranean air grows cool, carrying the scent of time and the distant sea, and perhaps the first faint, hopeful whisper of feathers being carefully, secretly assembled. Let the image of that complex, ancient world with its proud kings, its cursed beasts, and its brilliant, troubled inventors now soften and dissolve. The dilemmas and adventures of Daedalus can rest as you too prepare to surrender to the gentle labyrinth of your own dreams. May they be far less confusing and infinitely more peaceful than the one he so masterfully and so tragically designed. The story is told and a quiet night awaits.